Okay, let's get started. So thank you for joining us today for Public Funds Public Schools webinar, Save Neighborhood Public Schools, Say No to Private School Vouchers. Today we'll be discussing the concerning connection between private school voucher programs and public school closures and the negative impacts of those closures on students and communities. I'm Jessica Levin from Education Law Center, and we lead the Public Funds Public Schools campaign, which is a national campaign to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen our public schools and are not diverted to vouchers and other private education uses. There's certainly a lot going on with vouchers right now at the state level, with legislatures both enacting and rejecting voucher legislation and courts like one in Utah striking down voucher programs. And then also certainly lots of activity at the federal level with the House Ways and Means Committee recently passing a budget bill that included a federal private school voucher scheme. So we'll attempt to keep you updated on those developments and how they would impact our specific topic today of vouchers exacerbating the under-resourcing of public schools and even leading to school closures. I want to thank Advancement Project and the Southern Education Foundation for their partnership and longtime collaboration in this work and for being part of this wonderful expert panel who you'll meet in a moment. And this webinar grew out of a collaboration between Education Law Center and Advancement Project to publish a recent policy brief of the same name as the webinar, Save Neighborhood Schools, Say No to Private School Vouchers. And we will put that link to the policy brief in the chat. And then the panelists who are here today did a panel on this topic at the recent Network for Public Education conference. So we're glad to be able to bring that content to all of you with this webinar. Please remember to put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. I want to turn things over to our wonderful moderator, Jessica Alcantara, who's a senior staff attorney at Advancement Project. Jessica, please take it away.
Thank you. I'm taking over the moderation for the other Jessica, so I'm so excited to be with everyone. Um, like Jessica said, I'm a senior staff attorney at Advancement Project, and we're a racial justice civil rights organization based in Washington, D.C. We practice movement lawyering, which means that we partner with grassroots organizations and provide legal policy, strategic communications, organizing support to help build power and win the changes that they want to see in their communities. I work on our education justice team, where we fight to protect public education and to eliminate the policing and criminalization of young people in schools, especially young people of color, because we envision a future in which our nation's public schools are places where young people are nurtured and supported so they are fully able to learn, grow, truly thrive. So excited to be here with everyone. Glad you all have joined us. Very important, very timely. Like Jessica said, there have been bills across several states currently in the federal government. Um, and really the growth of private school vouchers and the link to really this broader fight for public schools and public education generally. Like, we are at a very critical moment in this country when it comes to protecting public education. And we're going to get started because I know there's a lot that we're going to be talking about. So I'm thrilled to be joined by these three experts on our panel who are going to tell us more about the harms of vouchers and their connection to the rise in public school closures across the country. We have Laura Petty, who is currently a law fellow and staff attorney and my colleague here at Advancement Project. You've already met Jessica, who's the litigation director at Ed Law Center. And then last but certainly not least, Fred Jones, who is the senior director of public policy and advocacy at Southern Education Foundation. So why don't we get started? And I'd like to pass the mic to Fred. So can you tell us a little bit about your work and touch on the harms of vouchers, including, what we know of as the biggest harm, which is the how they drain money from public schools?
Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on the panel and your moderation as well. I just wanted to say thank you to PFPS again for giving me the opportunity to serve on this panel with you all. You guys do such great work, and I'm just honored to be able to sit with you all and be in community and try to share what I know in this space. The Southern Education Foundation is one of the longest standing education justice organizations in the country. We were founded just after the Civil War to help the formerly enslaved population establish a school system in the South. And we were founded really on the principle of a few things, but really trying to highlight the opportunity and the importance of public schools. So I have just a few slides that I wanted to go over with the audience to talk more about the harms of school vouchers, and just want to make sure that you guys can see this. Perfect. So just to get some minute in history, it's just important to know, especially in the South, how public schools started. They really started just after or during the Reconstruction era, just after the Civil War, when it was really Black lawmakers in the South who introduced and was able to lead to the passage of funding for public schools. Now, at the time, obviously, they were segregated schools, but it did create the financial mechanism to establish a public school system in the South. And so it was really the leaders here just introducing legislation and talking to their colleagues to garner the bipartisan support to create this tax system for there to be public schools. And as we move forward over the decades, and especially really following Brown versus Board of Education, we start to see school vouchers or forms of school vouchers emerge. And really, vouchers came about to circumvent integration efforts following Brown versus Board of Education. And so we put together really a list of the most prominent reasons to oppose school vouchers, which really includes that they're baked from a racist origin, but like I just said, but they're also inefficient and duplicative. They lack accountability and safety guardrails, which I'll go into momentarily. Not all students can equally access vouchers as well, especially rural students. And then many times, students and families have to give up their civil rights to actually participate in the programs. And one of the things that I also mentioned is last on this list, but certainly not last to me, and honestly could be first, is many of the voucher programs fail to improve academic performance. And so it's really a direct harm on our students to be able to participate in these programs knowing that they actually don't benefit from them. And just for context here, 15 of the 17 southern states have at least one school voucher program. The bullet is correct, but the map isn't correct. I have to put a star on Texas, unfortunately. They are the latest state to pass a school voucher program, and from my understanding, it will be the most expansive in terms of funding. So just wanted to let you guys know that as well. I just don't have a lot of good communication skills in design, but there should be a star on Texas, but many of our states, unfortunately, have at least one school voucher program, and it's draining tens of millions of dollars away from the public school system. And so to directly answer your question, Jessica, there is a financial direct cost to the harms of school vouchers. An example of this is once Florida actually passed their latest universal school voucher program, the public school system is seeing about $4 billion less in funding. And so they're not able to receive that purely because of the voucher program that was passed there. There are also indirect costs. So once students leave the public school system, the public schools still have fixed costs. So they still have to do building maintenance. They still have to do other programs to actually operate a school system. And now they have less funding to do so. And also in the instance where there's additional or there still maintains fixed costs, the cost to put on additional programs are higher. So the per pupil expenditures or the per pupil needs go up once more and more schools or students leave the public school system. An example of this is you could be in an AP program one year, and then the school district may not provide an AP program the next year. And that's simply because there are fewer resources that the school is able to access due to students leaving the public school system. We also know that if a student accepts a voucher, goes to a private school, but then does not like that experience and returns to the public school system, the money then does not fall automatically transfer back to the public school system. So what we see is many students actually don't like using the voucher and the opportunity that they are receiving in the private school, but that money does not fall back to the schools in terms of educating them. We also see many instances of financial abuse where school vouchers have paid for jet skis, tickets to Disney World, trampolines, golf clubs, and golf lessons. I wouldn't say that those really have a pure academic benefit. Um, and then this is on top of known embezzlement that takes place as well. So there's certainly harms, financial abuse and harms that in that way. And then one of the things I'll just lastly say is when students receive a voucher, it's not an automatic that the teachers are certified or pass criminal background checks. It's not an automatic that the buildings themselves are passing safety codes. So I just want to just end with that, just because like some of these places are just literally not safe spaces to be. Now, I'm not speaking for all of them, but certainly the lack of the guardrails that are put in place because there's not a lot of accountability allows things like this to take place where the building may not be in a good place, or there could be, you know, leaders in the school who wouldn't normally pass a background check. So these are all the harms, or these are some of the harms that take place due to the voucher programs. And I know you guys are going to go into more details about an additional harm in terms of just the closing of the public schools. So again, I just wanted to close out here. I'll stop sharing my screen and return it back to you, Jessica. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Brad. I really appreciate that grounding us in kind of the history of public education, especially in the South, and that, you know, even though vouchers are growing now, it's clear that it's not new, and that it, you know, the racist origins have kind of, you know, continued to today, including some of the things you shared about the threats to student safety, right? Because you mentioned obviously there are monetary costs, but clearly a laundry list of non-monetary, non-financial costs to students and families and communities too. And on that, I'd like to pass it to Jessica. No, I'm just kidding. I'm passing it. Wait, who am I passing it to? Jessica. There's a lot of food for thought that Fred just shared with us. I'm excited to hear more about your work. Can you tell us more about the connection between vouchers and school closures?
Yes, thank you, Jessica. And thank you, Fred. It's, I think, invaluable that we tell the truth about vouchers right now, especially in this political moment, when some are not swayed by facts, but hopefully many still are. And then we tell the truth about the origins of vouchers, the effects of vouchers, so that people really know what these programs are about. And so getting back to the topic of closures and vouchers, how do they connect? Vouchers are incompatible with adequate and equitable public school funding. And that's because they divert public funds away from public schools. And Fred has already explained some of this to us, and I want to just add a little bit more to what he said, and then talk about some examples. So how exactly do vouchers divert public funds away from public schools? Sometimes the funding mechanism for vouchers takes the money for them straight out of public education budgets, like school district appropriations. And that's the case in several states, including Florida, which Fred mentioned. And you can look at the report from Education Law Center and the Florida Policy Institute quantifying that direct loss from districts, and it really is dramatic and obviously has grown as Florida's voucher program has universalized. And then Tennessee's original education savings account voucher program, they now have a universal one as well, but the earlier one is another example of voucher funds being taken directly from district appropriations. So it's very easy to see how that undermines public school funding. Now, many newer voucher programs are funded from state general revenue, but it's very important to understand that that doesn't mean that they don't take money from public schools for a couple of reasons. First, public funding itself is finite. That's why a lot of state constitutions have constitutional firewalls protecting public funds for education, limiting them only to public schools. So public funding is finite. When you divert hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to vouchers every year, there is less funding available for public goods, including public schools. And public schools are usually the biggest line item in a state's budget. So you're taking away from that pie, you necessarily are endangering already too limited public education funding. Second, public school funding itself is based in significant part on enrollment. So when students leave their public school district to take a voucher, the district loses money. But as Fred explained, it still has fixed costs. And the school district will likely have a higher concentration of high-need students, such as students with disabilities, who private schools often can't serve or refuse to serve. And then, of course, Fred made the very important point that students may take a voucher and go to a private school, but then leave midway through the year because of low academic quality, discrimination, lack of special education services, et cetera, where the family had no recourse. And so now the money has been wasted, but the child, of course, is welcome and legally entitled to re-enroll in their neighborhood public school. So for all those reasons, now the public school, which may already have been underfunded, is trying to do more with even fewer resources. And we often talk about how that means the school will have to cut programs and services or staff, increase class sizes, and do other things that we know from evidence-backed research harm student outcomes and well-being. But now we are getting to the point where the cuts are so severe as voucher programs grow and universalize that the cuts are causing and contributing to the actual complete closure of neighborhood public schools and not just the reduction in staff and other resources. So let me give you a few examples. These come from the PFPS and Advancement Project policy briefs. You can get more information there. And of course, it is heavily footnoted, again, facts. This is all backed by facts. So examples, Arizona, which is was the first of now about 15 universal voucher states, meaning that any student is eligible for a voucher regardless of family income or whether they ever attended a private school. In its first full year, Arizona's universal voucher program cost the state over $700 million, or equal to over 11% of the state's education budget, while only serving a little over 6% of its students. And the cost of vouchers in Arizona is projected to reach $1 billion in 2025-26. The program set off a wave of school closures across the state in places like Paradise Valley Unified School District, Roosevelt School District, Phoenix Elementary School District, and Cave Creek Unified School District. They all announced school closures, citing enrollment drops and budget shortfalls. Another example is Florida, as it often is in the voucher world. During the 24-25 school year, Florida's voucher program cost almost $4 billion and diverted an estimated 18% of state public education funding from school districts. And this has created budget crises that set off school closures and mass layoffs in school districts across the state, including Hillsborough, Broward, Duval, and Miami-Dade counties. And even states with non-universal voucher programs are seeing them result in school closures. And we have examples of that in the policy brief in Iowa and West Virginia. So I know that Advancement Project are some of the foremost experts on the impacts of these closures. So look forward to hearing about that.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's so, when you actually look at the numbers, it's so troubling, especially when you start using the B word, billion. We're talking about billions of dollars that public schools that already are struggling to be fully funded are just further not getting because of vouchers. So I'd like to turn now to Laura, my colleague. I know you joined Advancement Project specifically to work on a project about school closures. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And especially what Jessica mentioned about those impacts you've seen of school closures on students and communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, everyone, I'm going to share my screen as well. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So like Jessica said, I came to Advancement Project to help build out the support that we could offer to organizers who are fighting school closures. And when I arrived at AP a little less than 2 years ago, my colleagues like Jessica had been hearing about school closures returning in school districts where some of our grassroots partners are located, but we just didn't know how prevalent it was. So I started by tracking school closures across the country using news alerts. And when I started doing this, I happened to notice handfuls of districts in Arizona and Florida announcing school closures. And then over the past 2 years, as Jessica and I have built out this work, we've been hearing more and more, getting more outreach from organizers, advocates, and community members from both of those states, from Arizona and Florida, who are concerned about school closures. And so for context, I think as Jessica L. mentioned, Florida and Arizona, I believe were the first 2 states to pass universal voucher laws. Is that right, Jessica? Yeah. So I want to be clear that when we're talking about the permanent closures, that right now we're talking about the permanent closures of neighborhood public school. And we believe that this is really about the fight for public education itself. We know that this struggle is not new, and thanks to Fred for sharing that history. This is just the latest battle in the decades-long resistance to Reconstruction era reforms and civil rights era reforms, and to providing a free quality education to Black, Latina, Native American, and low-income children. The school closures happening today are part of a long history in the US of policymaking that forces certain communities to make the biggest sacrifices. We saw this in the school desegregation era when Black schools were closed and Black students were the ones who were forced to travel to hostile white communities. And when white flight away from public schools and cities caused policymakers to neglect and systemically underfund schools serving predominantly Black children. And then about a decade ago, Advancement Project did a lot of work supporting organizers fighting school closures that were mostly happening in Black communities. And these were schools that had been deemed, quote, failing and forced to be closed or, quote, turned around, all incentivized by policies like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. And we're seeing in the decade since then, since in the last couple of years, in this new wave of school closures that we are on the brink of, we believe we're just on the brink of today, we're documenting this in real time, and we're seeing the same root causes, such as historical resistance to providing high quality education to Black and other communities of color. But with the same root causes, we're seeing this current wave propelled and exacerbated by some new factors, including the unprecedented expansion of private school voucher laws. So to get to your question, Jessica, about the impact, we know that losing a school is often a harmful and traumatic loss for a whole community. Families lose easy access to relationships with staff, to resources for students, and resources for families like adult education, a polling location, or a gathering space for community events. And as I think was alluded to before, we at Advancement Project, as a racial justice organization, we are in this work because we see time and again that these harms are imposed on Black, Latina, and low-income communities, those communities where our grassroots partners organize. And so from the wave of mass school closures that Advancement Project supported fights in the early 2010s, we actually now have a whole body of academic research that examines the impacts of those closures on students, families, and communities. And from that, we know that there's no evidence of any benefit for students and families who experience those closures. But we have a lot of evidence of harm. And finally, I think it's important here to take a step back and look at the bird's eye view of this. A lot of our work at Advancement Project anyway, just because of the nature of what we do, is rooted in local political battles over school closures. But I think we should not lose sight of the big picture. The goal is actually to eliminate the institution of public education, and this is how it gets carried out. It begins with this investment in public schools and diversion of funds to private schools so that eventually public schools get closed one by one. So while in each district it might seem like a hyperlocal issue, the organizers we support who are fighting to save their local public schools from closure are truly on the front lines of this fight to save public education. Thank you.
Well, that was heavy. And really just a devastating picture of what it looks like for, schools to be closed in so many communities, so widespread. And it sounds like the harms are universal, like there are really no positives for students about school closures. So I have a few questions, and then hopefully we will get to any questions that folks have submitted. But my first question is maybe for Fred or Laura. How have you seen the harms you've all mentioned play out in the communities that you work with?
Laura, would you like to go first? Or you want me to go first?
You can go first, Fred.
Sure. I'll just give one example. The Southern Education Foundation is based in Atlanta, Georgia. Georgia recently passed a new education savings account, so a form of a school voucher here. They came up with rules documenting how that will unfold. And one of the examples that I'll provide is the law was written in a way that it's supposed to support students who are zoned to attend the bottom 25% of schools in the state. However, a technical sort of difference, I won't say difference, but a technical element that people didn't initially catch was that any student who lives in an attendance zone of a school in the bottom 25% would be eligible for the voucher. So what this means is if you're high school, if you're zoned to attend a high school, but you're in an elementary school right now, that's not in that bottom 25%, you can actually get a voucher. And also and vice versa. So if you're in high school and there's an elementary school that you would be zoned for, you can also get a voucher. And so this has actually exploded the possible costs of the program itself. And additionally, I'll just use me as an example. So we go to one of the highest performing elementary schools. My children go to one of the highest performing elementary schools in the state. However, I'm technically eligible for a voucher because most of all of the high schools in the county are on this list. So it becomes a point where I would say even for when the lawmakers were designing this bill, they were designing it to support certain student populations who may be in chronically underperforming schools. But like the way that is carried out isn't actually the case in many instances. Like whole counties are becoming eligible for the voucher when I don't think that was the original intent. Long story short is I see the harms taking place. Like once there is just a little bit of an opening. So once a targeted program takes place, the hope is for it to become universal or to open up a program as much as possible. And so whether it's through regulations, whether it's through additional laws, or things that will be carried out in additional years, we just see sometimes that a program can start small and then expand.
Yeah, and just to provide some other examples, in one of the slides that I just shared, I spoke about like all of the harms that have been uncovered by the academic research that school closures have on children. They're linked to behavior outcomes, to test scores, to graduation rates, et cetera. But I just want to highlight, from the work that Jessica and I do supporting grassroots organizers, some of those like more intangibles. So we hear when communities are organizing to fight school closures, just like frustration from parents, just losing a hub and an institution close to home where they can just walk their children or feel safe letting their children walk themselves, where many of the staff might come from the community, and just having that local hub close by that they can easily access and easily go visit if need be. We hear a lot of frustration from young people, from students whose schools are closed or whose schools are threatened to be closed. Just like, I don't know, I'm sure some people on this call when they were growing up had to move schools. And that's a huge transition for a young person. And just feeling that is forced upon you, where you have to start all over and make brand new relationships. These are heavy things that children have to experience. Particularly if you have to start over in a new place that's much further away from home where you don't know anybody. And then one other example I wanted to highlight is we actually saw in 2021, St. Louis Public Schools closed a bunch of neighborhood schools in Black communities. And those communities were promised that all of these improved outcomes, that in exchange for sacrificing their schools and losing their local schools, that they were going to get better resources at their new schools. And we see what we hear from community members in St. Louis is that those promises have not been kept at all, and that students and families aren't getting those improved services or improved resources that they were promised when schools closed.
And I'll add to that, Laura, that in St. Louis, they want to do more school closures, don't they? Even though, they never actually fulfilled the promises after the first round of the school closures. Um, Awful, awful all around. I have maybe one final question, and then I see we have some questions from the audience that we're excited to get to. So this one, anyone can answer. Um, how can we affirmatively fight for public schools?
So I
My
can
question,
jump
yeah.
I can jump in again. And I'm curious to hear what Jessica L. and Fred have to say as well. But from the perspective of us at Advancement Project who support organizers in communities, in the very communities that have been historically underinvested in and neglected by policymakers, and like policymakers for decades and decades have made the political decisions to starve public schools in these communities that our organizers work in. And so I think for that reason, a lot of folks from those communities come into this fight to save public education with kind of like a more nuanced view than maybe some others. Because of course, in many, parts of the country and in maybe many neighborhoods and particularly better resourced and whiter neighborhoods, public schools have really served communities and their students well, have really done a good job. But again, too often, we support folks who are fighting for schools that have not been served. And yet those school communities, despite all of that underinvestment, have built thriving places where great teachers work, where parents have sought the best for their children, and where people have formed important relationships and rely on those services. And so I think with that nuanced view, what we see is the same organizers who we fight to stop school closures are usually the same people who have been fighting demands, who have been fighting campaigns and making demands for a long time for the kind of schools that they actually do want to see. And so, for example, one of our national partners, the Journey for Justice Alliance, has a sustainable community schools platform, and you can visit the J4J website to learn more about it. But basically, the idea of a community school is a public school, is investing in a public school in a community, and ensuring that that school provides the kind of resources that the community needs. And that can look like everything from adult education classes to health clinics to particular after school programs to a space for the community to use. And so these are the kind of affirmative things that the organizers who we support have been fighting for all along. And now, when put into this defensive posture of not only having to fight affirmatively for the kind of decriminalized, liberatory education where all students can thrive and families can feel welcomed, communities are forced to put on the defensive. But I think it's important that they're always keeping in mind what they've been asking for.
Jessica, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. Well, I think this panel is an example, and you panelists, co-panelists are an example of what I'm about to say. But I think what we can do first of all is be brave. This is not a moment to be wishy-washy about things. Obviously, there is so much going on, but to center as much as we can the fight for public education as a cornerstone of our democracy, and remember the following things, and get the word out about the following things: that vouchers have so many dangers to public schools, to civil rights, to efforts to desegregate. They harm all of these things and don't do any good. Second, that what is the goal of privatization of public education? And Laura was already touching on this. The goal is to defund and dismantle public education. And I think that the time is here that we can't be afraid to say that, and make sure people know that. It's certainly not the motive of everyone who supports privatization, and certainly not the motive of individual parents who are doing the best and making the best choices for their children, but on a systemic level with policymakers and with very wealthy funders of privatization campaigns. That is the goal. And we know that because people have been caught on tape saying it, about universal voucher programs, for example. And so, to paraphrase Maya Angelou, when people tell you who they are, believe them. And this is what they're trying to do. And I think that they're no longer even trying to really hide that. And third, to know and get the word out that most people support their public schools, that people are overwhelmingly happy. Survey data shows for decades with their own neighborhood public school and their children's public school, including how the public schools did during the pandemic. So the narrative on what's really happening on the ground in public opinion is different from the narrative that's happening and being pushed by billionaire backers of privatization to try to create an appetite for privatization. And also that most people do not support vouchers in actual legitimate polling. And when people are given more information, the support for vouchers goes down still. So being brave about saying all those things, knowing that so many brief people are standing together is really important, that policymakers and educators and students, parents and attorneys and advocates across the country are all largely standing together for public schools, and that it is really the minority of backers, but they happen to have a lot of resources who are backing privatization. So there are so many then different avenues for fighting privatization and advocating for our public schools. One is legislative, getting involved, knowing what's happening in your legislature, your state legislature. You can look at the Public Funds Public Schools Voucher Bill Tracker on our website to learn what's happening in your state, and then getting in touch and being involved in that legislative process. Direct democracy. Every single time that vouchers have been put to the voters on a ballot, they have been rejected by the voters. And that goes for 3 different states in the 2024 elections. So getting involved in that and knowing that that's true. Finally, I would be remiss as a lawyer if I didn't mention litigation. It's a very important tool for when voucher bills do pass. And that doesn't, though, just go for lawyers being involved. There is a significant community and communications and public education aspect of successful litigation that many in the community can get involved in. And finally, I'll just say that we know what works for public schools from data and research. We know what we have to do to adequately fund our public schools and to put in place the programs and resources that evidence shows work to give every student the opportunity for an adequate and equitable public education. We just need to have the political will to actually do that.
Well said. I don't know if I can say anything better, but I'm going to try to just stick to a couple points that I think complement what you just heard from Laura and Jessica. It's just one, I think we have to acknowledge that public schools are also just not perfect. I think they can be strengthened. It doesn't mean that they should be eliminated, right? So as Jessica just went over, most people love their public schools. They support their public schools. And I think we need to acknowledge that, but they can get better, and we're here to make them get better. I think the other thing is, though, we have to understand what it takes to actually make sure students are meeting their academic potential and actually meeting what the departments of education and the state constitutions require of them. What this means is, like, what does it actually take to educate a student? And so the finance gurus actually say, on average, especially students who are coming or living in low-income communities, they need at least $30K per year to meet state norms. There's no state in the country that's doing per pupil funding at $30K. And really it's 30 to 40K. This is what Dr. Bruce Baker says from Rutgers University. And so I think public schools, despite not being at a level that they need to be, are doing a fantastic job. They're actually overperforming based off the investments. And so I just want to elevate that point. Like, public schools are actually doing better than what people are giving them credit. And just understand that there's, and my third point here is that there's also like public school choice that currently exists as well. Oftentimes a lot of pro-voucher supporters saying, don't you want more choice, and don't you want more choice? I'm like, we have a system that has choice in it. It may not be the most optimal, but there's currently choice in the public school system that doesn't harm the traditional public schools certainly as much as the vouchers. And the last point I just want to make, which Jessica kind of touched on, is the fact that there still haven't been like wide scale, I would say, analysis, pure academic analysis that shows that voucher students are doing better academically than their like public school peers. And there's so many examples that show that voucher students actually do worse on average. You can go state by state. There's stuff in Louisiana, there's stuff in South Carolina. We did some new analysis in Alabama looking at the reports there. So we know voucher, if you think academic proficiency is a core goal of an education, you can see that public school students are actually overperforming and doing better than students who are using vouchers. So there's no purpose of investing into this program, vouchers that is, as opposed to trying to strengthen and elevate the traditional public school system.
Exactly. And I'll add to that the same goes for school closures, right? That school closures don't provide the academic benefits that their proponents would like to tell you that they do. Like school closures and vouchers, both, from the few studies that they do have on school closures, and I'm sure there's what's been done on vouchers, it is worse for students. It is worse for students. So I'd like to turn to some questions. We got a few from the audience. There's a quote someone put in there that I wanted to say out loud because I think it gets at this broader view of public education and public schools. It's from 2008 by humorist Garrison Keller. When you wage war on the public schools, you attack the mortar that holds the community together. You're not a conservative, you're a vandal. And I feel like that relates to this first question in terms of this messaging piece. How are we getting the messaging out there, and how do we communicate with people about what these harms are, and how to make people understand why vouchers are harmful, why school closures are harmful? What are some effective ways to educate people about the damage vouchers will impart?
I'll just say just a couple quick ones. I know I've been talking a lot, but oftentimes in rural communities, public schools are the #1 employer. Vouchers oftentimes decimate the public school system, so you're literally putting community members out of work. And these are students or I would say these are adults who are key members and pillars of their community. So that's one of the things, just trying to understand that vouchers are disproportionately harm rural communities. And those who live in rural communities cannot, in many instances, don't have a private school to go to. So there's unequal access to the opportunity that a voucher has.
I would just say on a general level that public funds, public schools, I know SEF as well, have succinct fact sheets about the harms of vouchers, 2-pagers, talking points, and please, take those, look at those, use them, however they may be helpful to you. And they're on different topics and different aspects of the harms of vouchers. Public Funds Public Schools also has an interview series with grassroots state and local advocates who explain how they go about doing this work in their communities that have incredibly helpful tips straight from the experts on how to talk to your community about vouchers. So I encourage you to read those interviews on our website as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that point, like I'm no messaging expert, but I think with our work at Advancement Project supporting people who are fighting school closures, like we see time and again, any school district leaders are afraid to close schools because they know everyone gets mad, everyone gets up in arms about it. And so I think, part of what we're trying to do is, providing the tools and support for folks to fight the issue before it gets to the point of school closures, because school closures are oftentimes kind of like the last stop in the train. But drawing that connection between, this wonky policy that might be happening at the state level or, at this point might be happening at the federal level, drawing the connection between, some jargon written into the tax code and your neighborhood public school, I think is really important.
Thank you all for sharing. We have another messaging question. Someone submitted, in Florida, where I live, the state budget within 2 years is expected to be in deficit to the tune of at least $6 billion. Florida is expected to be doling out $5 billion this year and likely $6 billion in 2 years. What messaging should we be doing now before this happens?
I just put one idea out there, which is contextualizing this for people, that amount of money. For example, with how many specific resources it could pay for in the public schools that serve 90% of kids. So, for example, we have a policy brief on our website with the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy where we did this, and we took the amount of money that would go to an Idaho Universal Voucher Program and talked about how many teachers, how many computers, how many buses, et cetera, that could pay for. So that's one idea for messaging to make it more real for everyone, this enormous loss of funding, which is just hard to conceptualize in the abstract.
I would say I would ask the question, are students better off? You've made this huge investment. I won't even say investment. I'll say divestment, really. But either way, all this money is now going to this program. Are the students who are participating in the program better off? Are those in the public school system better off? And if you don't know that information in many states, they don't because there's not data available. As financial stewards, shouldn't the government and the public know that information? So it gives you the hopefully additional sort of rationale to get more data from the state to show if these programs are working or not. And that's what I would first do on those two fronts. And I'm sure there's a lot of people doing that already, but asking the question, just understanding, like, are students better off? Can we use this money in a better way that will hopefully be better off for the majority of the students?
That is a great segue to the next question that folks had, which was, given what they assume is a very intentional absence of data about outcomes for students who take vouchers, are there any research efforts to track data that we can collect from public schools that could be powerful? For instance, tracking mobility rates of students with disabilities due to lack of services in private schools, or tracking learning loss for students who return after temporarily accepting a voucher or ESA?
We're going to be releasing some information soon that at least is able to do an analysis on the current academic performance of existing school voucher programs in specific states that do report. It is a limited amount of states, but it will specifically look at the academic performance of those who've received a voucher versus those who don't or who have not. And so we'll be able to at least put that out there. So that should be coming soon.
That's exciting. I'm looking forward to that, Ryan. I just want to emphasize the first part of this audience member's question, which is that this is a deliberate choice on the part of policymakers not to make data available. Somebody has to write the voucher laws and pass them. And so they could be putting in accountability and data collection measures, but they are choosing not to. So that's really important to remember and emphasize. And one thing to be done is to make that point and push for more data collection in these laws. It can even be passed after a voucher law is passed. Southern Education Foundation and PFPS a few years ago put out some materials on a bill in Arkansas that had, after the fact of establishing their first voucher program, added data collection measures. And then we took that data and we analyzed it, and guess what? It was bad and poorly collected. But that can be done at any point to voucher statutes. They can be added to. But it is a deliberate choice, and Public Funds Public Schools has been tracking voucher bills and reading every voucher bill in every state legislature and Congress for more than 5 years. And we can tell you that accountability measures are significantly decreased over time, and particularly since the earliest voucher programs in places like Wisconsin that had a little bit more data collection and public accountability measures, they are fairly non-existent today.
And I think just to touch on something like tangential, obviously, of course, the lack of data is on purpose. I think we have been hearing more and we've been seeing more and more like really good press reporting on like what these programs actually look like. So I think some people, when they first hear about private school voucher programs, depending on, you know, their positionality in society, like when they hear private school, they might think of like, you know, the Good Poet Society or some kind of like elite school or even a segregation academy that serves, you know, more well-to-do families and often whiter families. Um, I think the important thing to know about these programs is like private schools choose their students. So what that means when this system plays out is when private schools get to choose their students, the students who don't get chosen end up with like oftentimes just like complete mess of or I'm not saying this well, but like with worse options and schools that like are not meeting their needs and oftentimes are like even inferior to what they were getting in public schools. And so in that sense, it's a scam. Like it's really an attempt to scam families who haven't been served well by the public school system.
We have another question here, kind of a little bit of a pivot more towards the funding side. If a state fully funds its school funding formula, does that undermine an argument about the constitutionality of any general revenue funding diverted to a voucher program? Because this is what Missouri just did.
That's a great question. I could start out. The bottom line is no. It does not undermine that argument. And I'll make just a few points on that. First of all, fully funding a state's funding formula doesn't mean that schools are fully and adequately funded. Many states' funding formulas, even ones that have gotten better over time, are still not sufficient. As Fred was talking about the latest research and the latest numbers, that we know what is needed, and states are still not doing fully what is needed to fund their public schools. Second, fully funding a state school funding formula doesn't mean that voucher money doesn't still come out the back door, either directly or through loss of enrollment, as we talked about earlier. So you could fully fund, but that's why vouchers are antithetical to full funding, because they just take the money out the back. Missouri, you can look at Education Law Center resources to learn about whether school funding in your state is considered adequate and fair, with our Making the Grade report. The latest report from Missouri shows that Missouri has a school funding level below the national average, that its school funding distribution is regressive rather than flat or progressive. So regressive meaning that more money is, more state money goes to more affluent districts and less to higher need districts, which is not the way it should be. And finally, that Missouri's funding effort, which is measured as funding for public schools as a percentage of state GDP, is subpar. So if Missouri school funding, gets better, that's great, but that doesn't mean it's adequate, and it doesn't mean that vouchers aren't undermining it.
I don't know if anyone else wanted to add on to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say at the end of the day, even if that is the case, it's a choice to give money to parents who can afford private school rather than send it literally anywhere else for any other public use.
I see another question in the Q&A. And we have, maybe this will be the last question, and then we'll wrap up here since we only have a few minutes. What are the panel's thoughts on coupling school voucher expansions or development with investments in public education? Should this be deemed as a win? I'm seeing this in a number of states seeking to advance or who have already advanced. How might we go about navigating these types of landscapes to further support public education funding sources in the future?
It's a pickle. Ultimately, no. Like anything that has a voucher in it, we feel harms the overall public school system, despite the fact that they're often paired with additional funding or additional investments to the public school system. It's now used as a, a political wedge and weapon to push vouchers forward. Unfortunately, it's a really good question, and oftentimes it's something people have to ask themselves. It's just difficult, and I don't mean to belittle it because it's hard. Because we still need more funding in our public school system, but ultimately having vouchers there, both in the short and the long term, will harm students, harm those in the public school system. So we have to keep fighting to make sure that that doesn't happen or that doesn't expand. Jessica Levin laid out many different instances in which you can continue to mitigate that, despite the fact that vouchers are on the books. And I do think data collection and accountability, fiscal accountability, is a good way to do that. Litigation could be as well. And I think just making sure that folks know. Jessica, you made a great point around like fully funded and adequacy are different things. And I think we need to continue to think about that as well. So I don't think you can consider it a win. Maybe you can internally, but I would continue to just really try to push back against the advancement of vouchers at all costs. And just also elevate the fact that we have choice in our public school system too. So I don't want to ignore that point as well, because sometimes that does get ignored.
Yeah, that's well said. It is nuanced. I would say that what happens often in practice and is very bad is that adequate public school funding gets held hostage to the passage of voucher programs. And that is, that's a travesty, because public education, well-funded public education, is a state constitutional mandate across the country. Funding of vouchers is not only a terrible idea, but it is often prohibited by state constitutions across the country. So these are very differently situated types of policies, and one shouldn't depend on the other. Public education is arguably our most important public good, and vouchers are one of the chief failures of public policy in the last few decades. So just very, very different things. They shouldn't be paired together.
Well said. And any other closing remarks before I wrap up? We have about a minute left. I just want to thank you all again for joining us in the audience. Thank you to our panelists. Really great information. There's been a lot of resources shared in the chat. This webinar has been recorded, so this is a resource that we're going to be sending out for folks who registered. And please, again, if you haven't seen already the policy brief that Public Funds, Public Schools, and Advancement Project have released, it's on the website, and they've linked it in the chat too, where you can find it, connecting school closures and vouchers. If you get nothing else out of this webinar, vouchers bad, school closures bad. Let's not do either. But thank you all for joining us, and reach out to any of our orgs if you have any follow-up, and love to keep fighting for public education. Thanks all.